Hi everyone, I am Samir Sathe. I lead the Advantage program focused on small and medium-sized enterprises in India on behalf of Wadhwani Foundation. This is a program that is a unique program that accelerates the growth of SMEs, basically with the purpose to create jobs. And our mission is to mobilize all the resources that are required by the SMEs to make that growth happen. On this very interesting occasion of World MSME Day, I'm very happy to share with you that we are kicking off with a series of fireside chats with reputed advisors that are part of our ecosystem. And I'm very happy to start this series, to kick off this series with Sunil Mishra, who is the founder and leader at AceNet EVP Consultancy. This is one of the most reputed consulting firms in India, and they are going global as well to basically help the SME ecosystems, which forms a part of our purpose statement at Wadhwani Foundation. And I'm very happy to welcome you, Sunil, on this first inaugural sort of fireside chat as far as we are concerned. Welcome.
Thank you, Samir. Always pleasure catching up with you. And this is actually a great start. Wadhwani Foundation itself has been doing a phenomenal job in SME growth in India and abroad. And I think we at AceNet are very pleased to join hands. And I look forward to having an interesting chat with you.
Thank you. Let me begin by asking Sunil to you about what does AceNet and EVP Consultancy do for the purpose of our viewers. Of course, we know each other very well, but it will be useful for you to summarize in a minute or two about what your firm does. How is it relevant to SME ecosystem in India?
Yeah, I think so. When I spent almost 2 decades with very renowned firms like Infosys, Cognizant, etc., doing both business and technology consulting, primarily in US, Europe, Middle East, and a lot of regions. When I moved back in India around 2017, I saw a need within SME and startup sector where there was a need to provide them strategic growth advisory, go-to-market, fundraising, capital restructuring, and all of it. And we felt that I think there was a huge gap. The larger consulting firms weren't really interested in supporting these SMEs and startups. Wherein we felt that this is something which we could do very, very nicely. Bringing in senior experts to advise these SMEs, and at the same time help them connect with the VCs, other funds for debt, equity, and other things. Interestingly, over the years, we have also built a fairly strong VC network, almost 200 plus VCs that we have added to our portfolio of partners, and we are able to provide that access to SMEs and startups for debt, equity, and so I think that's what we do. In addition, we also are working with some large IT consulting firms and other firms on the IT services side, IT business. For example, for SMEs, it could be a CRM solution or an inventory management solution or similar things. So we've been doing a lot of that as a second part of our business. That's the brief of what we do.
Fantastic. And Sunil, we have had exciting times working together in the past. And I'm sure the future is brighter than what we have done in the past because there's a lot to do together. Today's session, fireside chat session, is really focused on the topic of SME ecosystems, which is what we help, which is one of the fundamental drivers of the growth in India globally and also drivers of employment. So we have a couple of questions, and I would like to sort of begin by asking you specifically on the SME ecosystems in India. Firstly, what's your take on the current state of the SME ecosystem health in India? I mean, there are different reports that talk about the different aspects of SME ecosystem. We also know that we have set a very ambitious target of $5 trillion coming from India, and a substantial portion of that hopefully should come from the SME ecosystem. But we also know, on the other hand, given my experience of last 3 decades and having worked with hundreds and hundreds of organizations, and from your collective experience as well, that we scale of several thousands and millions of the very small SMEs who are not necessarily doing well, right? So on one hand, we have the tall aspirations and ambition. On the other hand, we have a trail. What is your take on the SME ecosystem health in India today? And what do you think are the top 3 things that we should do to address them?
Very important question, in fact. I mean, unfortunately, what is happening in India is I think the SME sector by itself is very huge. And I think a very significant portion, I think about 35% of the GDP contribution comes from the SME sector. However, if you look at the vast majority of the SMEs, they are well below the 5 crore revenue number. There's certain who are above 5 to 25, and then there are very few who are bigger. Unfortunately, there isn't very clear focus on many of these SMEs, either by the government or the private sector. So that's, I think, one of the biggest challenges that we face. And I think especially over the last 2 years, if you realized, while there were few sectors like EdTech, pharma, and others that grew exponentially, given the COVID demands. But the larger portion of the SMEs were hugely affected by the COVID. Many of them had to, shut down shop or at least be temporarily closed before they could recompete. Mm-hmm. Another big thing which is happening is I think the access to the credit has been fairly limited. I think that's one of the biggest challenges that we keep observing about SMEs. I think that's one major issue that we all need to look at very closely. And lastly, I think the global macroeconomics factors aren't really working very well. There's a huge impact of the global phenomena on India as well, while India by itself is doing very well. But the global factors are certainly affecting how the business model is in India. So these are the few factors which I believe are to be considered. Coming to your second question, Samir, I think you talked about what are the few things that need to be addressed to improve the SME health. I probably would put it slightly differently. So first and foremost, if I take the clue from the earlier point I talked about on the access to capital. While the government and the private sector has been trying to do a lot of different things, but a lot of it remains on paper. The credit, the access to credit, the access to working capital, money is still not as easy for most of the SMEs. And I think that continues to remain a challenge. For example, something slightly vague, if you can think of, what if we introduce some kind of a credit agency which actually rates these SMEs? And I'm not talking about the large corporates, I'm talking about SMEs, which does a rating based on their revenue, their stability, their GST and TDS payments, and so on. And so these are stable SMEs, or these are SMEs which are eligible for working capital loan at a much lesser rate, and these things can be processed relatively. If we could have something of the sort, I think the access to capital and the cost of capital both will be better for SMEs. So that's just a thought, which I think we all need to look at from cost of capital. Another point I just want to highlight here is if you look at the GST and the TDS, right? In my experience, working capital has been one of the biggest issues, and GST and TDS are one big contribution to that problem. If you look at the typical invoice cycle for any SME, you do the business for a month, or at the end of the month, you will raise an invoice. The moment you raise an invoice, within a few days, your GST is due, right? Your TDS would also be due. Sure. Wherein the invoice payments do not necessarily happen within the 45 days or 60 days, which is stipulated by the government, right? Government actually insists that SME payments must happen within 45 days. Many times these payments get dragged for 60 days, 90 days. And I'm also an angel investor, and I know many of these startups which I've invested in. They struggle to get the payments in a timely fashion from some of the very reputed firms. Now, with that, what happens is you're not only investing in the inventory management, in your cash flow management, and so on, you're also paying to the government from your pocket, right? For the period where client has not paid you, but you have already paid the GST and other taxes. Now, that gap is huge. Any entity which is doing, let's say, a 10 crore business and is paying 18% service tax has to keep 1.8 crore. I'm talking about the monthly, 10 crore business. So it has to keep that 1.8 crore per month aside for the GST payment. And that's a huge portion of the working capital that is taken from this pay. We're actually talking about 18% of the growth capital they could have otherwise utilized for some of their other needs. So these are some of the critical challenges when it comes to access to capital, which I believe must be addressed in the right way. The couple of other things which I believe, and I'll probably even seek your views on it. I think two other areas which I believe have to be addressed. One is the access to market, for SME. And in my experience, I think many of the SMEs come to us asking for, how do we improve our marketing? How do we improve our sales? Because end of the day, revenue generation is what they all are looking at. If they have revenue generation, they will have enough capital or cash to push back into the business to generate employment. So that access to that additional, market where they can sell their products or services is something that's a challenge. Interestingly, Government of India has actually come up with things like ONDC, Open Network for Digital E-commerce. These are likely to benefit some of the SMEs over the period of time. Very interesting initiatives. I think we just have to see how SMEs adopt to these, how the larger competitors play on these initiatives. Are they pushing back, or are they actually, joining hands? So these are two things. I'll pause for a moment, and then I think we could also talk about the technology, which is a third factor that plays a big role. Just want to, hear your views. Do you think this is the right approach, or there's anything else?
I think that's these are very valuable thoughts, and just to sort of share what I feel about some of the points that you mentioned: access to capital, access to markets, and participation in some of the government new initiatives such as ONDC are extremely helpful. So from my perspective, we have a dichotomic situation. We have about $600 billion of deficit in financing as far as the SMEs are concerned. So that's our internal calculation suggests. But on the other hand, there is no paucity of capital. It's about basically instilling the confidence in the lenders and investors that the money will be paid back. So I believe fundamentally there is an issue about the robustness of the business plan and ability to sort of scale up, which makes the lenders and the investors nervous, and which is why you will find lots of applicants but very few takers, because at the end of the day money doesn't exchange hands. So there is money available but unutilized and not leveraged. So I think we need to focus on the sort of improvement of the robustness of their scalable plans and revenue generation ability, which is your next point, which is access to markets and revenue sort of plans that need to be really bolstered. And at Wadhwani Foundation, as you know, we are very focused on the growth element of the MSMEs because that's ultimately for us, growth is survival. It's not that you survive and then you grow. It's basically growth is survival. And I think you are absolutely right on those 2 points. I completely concur with that. The other issue that we feel, I don't know what's your experience, Sunil, is that often there is the gap in implementation. 73% of the transformations really fail. And in SME's case, basically 90% of transformations really don't succeed, right? And that's a staggeringly high number. And I think that has to do with the deficit of skills in program management office in terms of how to implement things, etc. That also need to be imparted very effectively in addition to solving the problem of the SMEs. So I believe some of these are very, very important topics. And at the end of the day, when it comes to working capital cycles, so when it comes to revenue enhancement, when it comes to markets, etc., there also has to be an integrated approach between the ecosystem players. I think that brings you to my third question. And this is something that we have been debating, and I've been conversing with lots of people. I would love to understand your view. I find in many SME ecosystems in different industries, the interest of one stakeholder is at the trade-off with the other stakeholder, right? Whether it is supplier community or the customer community. So unfortunately, it's never a win-win, it's win-lose, right? And that makes it harder because, based on the theory of constraints, as you know, if the bottleneck is shifted, that doesn't mean the entire ecosystem will sort of improve. It just means that one part will improve, the other won't. But in business, there is an interdependency. So I think that's something that I would love to understand from you. What is your feeling? Can you give some examples when you feel that the interests are aligned, everybody is working towards the same mission of growth in different parts of the ecosystem? And some industries, probably it is not so. What is your take on that?
I think that's a very, very important point. And I think when we are looking at this question, we probably need to look at different stakeholders. If we just pick up on, first and foremost, SME versus startup. That's, I think, one of the focus areas, and I work very closely with both of these, and I understand the challenges and the advantages that both have at times. While startup ecosystem is actually doing very well for India, I think we have seen a completely different landscape over the last few years. At the same time, I think startups many times do have that, I wouldn't call unfair, but they do have advantage when it comes to funding, right? There are a lot of very smart individuals are coming forward to venturing into newer areas, and the VC funding is relatively easily accessible to some of them. Now that gives them an advantage. I think they can actually push a lot of the marketing and sales, very aggressively without really worrying about the working capital. Wherein, there are a lot of SMEs who work in an unorganized sector. Now they do not have the same, resources. They actually cannot afford to have a digital marketing solution or even a website. Many of them don't even have a website or e-commerce solutions or products. Whereas these newer players are coming in, I wouldn't name, but the quick delivery solutions that come in, I think they aren't necessarily solving the real, I would say the real problem. What they're trying to do is just facilitate quicker delivery, which may not necessarily be a need as of today, right? But I think they are much ahead of the game. They are coming in front of the grocery stores, and they're able to, just create a wrapper around the grocery stores, or create the cloud, the dark stores, and they're able to, service, and they're valued at a very, very high, valuation. Now, a grocery store can't really solve that problem. So I think we do have the startup SME thing, but I'm not saying startups are bad. I'm saying, they are great. It's just that, are they really having that unfair advantage which SME does not have? And which again brings me back to the access to capital, which SMEs don't necessarily have all the time. Secondly, if I look at government, right, I think I just talked about the GST or the TDS challenges. Government has its own targets. They are very happily talking about 1 lakh crore of GST collection in a month. Now, if you look at it, I think though from one hand it's that capital is required for government to put it back in the businesses and infrastructure and growth of the country, but on the other hand, somewhere it's putting pressure on the businesses to service the government's GST demands before they get paid for their own requirements. So I think these are conflicting things that I can think of, and definitely need to be looked at. I think there can be many other factors too, which can surely enable the SMEs to do better. But another example I can talk about is a lot of clients. They do say that we work with SMEs for our growth, because SMEs are kind of supporting them by providing components or small services which they themselves do not want to focus on. But when it comes to the payment cycles, they always are best. The SMEs are always pushing them back. They do not want to put the money on innovation. They want them to just keep servicing at the lowest price. So these challenges, I think, definitely conflicting priorities by different stakeholders, which need to be looked at differently by all of them to make sure there's a mutual growth for all the sectors in this.
Yeah, very true, Sunil. I think that sort of reminds me of several experiences that we have had when we wanted to serve, and we keep on serving these SME communities. I mean, a classic example is look at what is happening in automotive, right? So there is a movement towards EVs, right? EV infrastructure, EV components. So there is rationalization of components that is happening, but nobody's really trying to think about what is needed to convert the existing foundries to the infrastructure that can support the EV car, because most of them will be out of business very soon if they don't convert, right? Now, the interest of the foundries and the interest of the EV, if you put them side by side, actually should be to develop the SME ecosystem that is vibrant, healthy, and that's something that can live longer. But there is a lot of loss of capital when we think about a lot of SMEs dying because of outdated businesses. And on the other hand, there is a lot of businesses which are mushrooming very fast, getting the funding, like you said, because they are the new edge, right? But I think the net balance, as far as the SME ecosystem is concerned, could it still be negative or otherwise? I mean, the classic example, you work with startups. I was reading about a lot of the expense ratios of the startups to the revenue. I mean, there are 3:1, there's 7:1, 10:1, and there are multi-billion-dollar valuations, right? I wonder sometimes where is it all going? We obviously have third largest ecosystem in startups, and in fact, in one of my articles, I've talked about what startups can learn from SMEs and what can SMEs learn from startups, right? And I think there needs to be a healthy exchange of the ecosystem-wide view amongst the stakeholders to make a win-win situation. I completely agree with you. And the example that you gave of the receivables is a classic one, right? I mean, there's so much money is locked with large corporates, and SMEs need it, but it's a win-lose because they are not able to fight it, right? The interesting solutions come in receivable finance, even off-balance sheet ones, which are based on the risk of the buyer as opposed to the risk of the supplier, and that could really solve the problem. So we are talking to some of the service providers as well as we speak. But that's an interesting take, and I think this needs to be solved as far as we are concerned, and I'm glad that you concur with it. My last question to you, Sunil, in this series, which entire world is, we are also talking about all the times, is usage of technology to be able to make the life of the SME easier, healthier, and how they can live longer because of technology. A very quick 2 to 3 minute, your take on how are you doing it and how should all the advisory ecosystems should be able to do as far as the transformation is concerned on using technology.
Yeah, I think that's a very important question, Samir. And keep in mind, technology can take you to a very high scale very quickly, very rapidly. And we all understand that you can't really grow the organization from 10 people to 100 to 1,000 in 3 months' time. Wherein technology can enable you to service 10 users to 100 to 1,000 users within months, without any difficulty, as long as you build it the right way. Which SMEs aren't really, appreciating at the moment. I think though they have started to understand that there's a demand, there's a need for them to go digital. There's a need for them to automate many of their processes. I think their focus still remains the short term, which is a problem. They aren't really willing to invest in the long-term growth of the company, or many of them don't necessarily have the long-term vision. I think they probably are living by the day. And mainly because I think, again, the challenges are different, the needs are different, right? Startup ecosystem focuses more on the wealth creation over a longer period of time. For not just for the founders, but anyone else associated with it. And wherein an SME, I think their focus primarily is not necessarily always on wealth creation, but to build a sustainable business, which is running for a longer period of time. And of course, end of the day, it will result in wealth creation, especially for the founders. But at the same time, I think technology, unless you adopt it, I think you wouldn't really be able to solve many issues. For example, a lot of SMEs do not have an inventory management solution, which is the basic necessity for any manufacturing firm or any company which is having a lot of moving parts, right? You would not understand what to order, when to order, and how quickly it will be consumed, when to do a reorder, and so on. So an inventory management is very critical. I was talking to one of the SMEs in the pharma sector. They don't really know that whether their sales folks are actually on the ground, are they visiting the doctors or not, right? Are they really generating enough revenue, which covers their own cost? Now, all these things can very easily be addressed by using some of the very smart solutions available in the market. You can do a geofencing, right? You can understand whether this person is at a particular location. You can ask the person to sign on from wherever he or she is at a given location, and that way you can track the location and show the person is there. You can also, track their contribution to the revenue, and then figure out how the margins are working out. I mean, is every individual covering their own costs and adding more to the company's growth? Because I did notice that one of the companies was actually having almost 15-20 salespeople. Half of them were not even covering their own costs. Now, that's a big challenge. You don't really have well-defined compensation and incentive models. Now, your incentive models could also be automated to a large extent. You can put the right structure and policy in place, and you can automate that so that for every order, the incentives are calculated. Similarly, a lot of focus has to be on innovation. I mean, when you come to SMEs, there are delivery solutions which are coming in, which could be using many of the IoT solutions or drones. Though it's a far-fetched thing for many of the SMEs, but it's a very interesting thing they could look at. For example, a warehousing company can look at how the utilization of the space is happening within the warehouse using the IoT solutions. Because more the efficient the warehouses are, better the leverage, better the revenue for them. They can project when a particular warehouse space is going to be empty. Trucks can be, tracked. The routing solutions have come in to track the movements of the vehicles. So I think many of these innovative things can be implemented by SMEs. And trust me, again, as I said, technology can give you what you otherwise would not be able to do if you're purely people dependent and people-led organization. In the sense, resource based. So you need to be adopting technology sooner than later if you have to scale up the operations 10x, 20x, 100x.
Yeah, and absolutely right, Sunil, and numerous examples there. Thanks for that, for educating our audiences and readers. In my experience also, the basic issues that entrepreneurs are dealing with are very interesting. They're dealing with the issues of how transparent they should be, because technology brings in transparency, right? Then there are issues with respect to the deficit, because they have just heard about digital transformation adoption, they read about it, they talk to people, but frankly, if you ask me, they really need to go to the basics in terms of what is it going to do to your specific processes and operations, such as revenues, interaction with the customers, supply chain efficiency, etc. And you have 10-15 minute conversation, they don't know, right? I think those are all the impediments between the espoused theory and the realized sort of theory, unfortunately. So I think there is a lot of groundwork that needs to be covered. It's a given that technology is going to be a fantastic sort of tool, but the user of the tool doesn't know how to use the tool. So I think that's the fundamental thing that we must solve for our SMEs. But I'm very glad that you mentioned, and I must tell all the viewers and readers that AceNet, Imbibe, as well as Wadhwani Foundation, Wadhwani Advantage, have focus on technology, using technology for the benefit of the SMEs and all the beneficiaries that we are talking about, whether it is digital transformation, whether it is use of AI, data analytics, whatever. But I think at the end of the day, it's a must. It's no longer whether. It's about when you want to sort of implement it and how you want to implement it. I would strongly recommend all the MSMEs who are reading this and watching this to take note of a couple of very important points that we discussed in this episode with Sunil, starting with the SME ecosystem health. What are the 3-4 things that we must do to address the health of the ecosystem in terms of improving them? And third, we talked about essentially whether the interest areas, the motives of the different stakeholders were in conflict with each other and how that can be resolved. And finally, we talked about how the technology is going to be used, should be used for the benefit of the SMEs and the SME ecosystem players. So thanks once again, Sunil, for being on this episode and your very valuable insights. I really enjoyed talking to you, as I always do between the two of us. Thanks once again, and I really appreciate your inputs.
Yeah, thanks, Samir. Again, this is really wonderful, and thanks again for inviting me and letting AceNet and Imbibe be part of Wadhwani Foundation's mega initiatives, improving the overall health and well-being of SME across the world. We're very happy to partner with you. We have had some extremely engaging and successful partnerships for the last 3 years, working with multiple SMEs, and I look forward to continuously build upon it. We will take this relationship forward. I think we're very focused on SMEs and startups. We have learned the hard way by working closely with them over the last few years. We would be very excited to speak with SMEs, through Wadhwani Foundation, provide whatever necessary input support they require, relook their existing businesses, grow the businesses, find solutions to the working capital issues, etc. So thank you again, and look forward to another chat, in 2 weeks. Thanks a lot, and have a lovely day.
Thanks, Sunil, for being a part of the family. All the best, and all the viewers and readers, do watch this episode, do read the transcript of this episode, and we'll be very happy to invite your questions, your sort of thoughts that come to your mind when you look at this particular episode, and very happy to get back to you and help you solve your transformation journeys to accelerate your own growth. Thanks once again, and all the best on this MSME Day to everyone.